Dear friends, welcome. I would first like to start by acknowledging my inspiration to Jaipur Dialogues, specifically the broadcast on 8th of August, which was titled Hindu Inferiority Complex, Time to Shed It. It was of course presented by our dear Sanjay Dikshit ji, and joining him was Dr. Rajat Mitra, a clinical psychologist with a lot of experience of working with the displaced persons, the Kashmiri Pandits who were thrown out of their homes and who were living in different, literally refugee camps in their own country. This is in continuation with the same topic. The title of this presentation is Psychological and Historical Roots of Nehruvian Blunders. Mr. Nehru was the first Prime Minister of India, and he was also a towering figure in history because he was responsible for most of the major decisions before the partition of India, during the partition of India, and in the later years. It is sad that his psychological makeup, which was influenced by a certain history, was never delved into. If he had been made aware of this, probably he would have acted differently. Friends, I shall begin with a brief introduction about myself. My name is Ashok Rajguru, and I live in Pune, Maharashtra, India. I have been a UK registered homeopath, and I have also been a certified instructor of aviation human factors. Aviation human factors essentially analyzes the underlying reasons of aircraft accidents and crashes. An aeroplane actually represents the pinnacle of human achievement in terms of technology and skill. And yet these aeroplanes crash. They are handled by human beings. Earlier, it used to be just a matter of blaming the pilot. But now we want to go deeper. Why should a highly skilled, mature person make mistakes? What are the underlying reasons? Because if we can identify those reasons, we can alter the future of aviation. Indirectly, we are peeping into the minds of people who commit blunders, either collectively or individually. Sometimes these errors can be rectified by engineering them out, by improving design, sometimes with procedures. But some deeper issues require a closer study. I come with this background, and my background in homeopathy allows me to understand and study human nature. Because after all, it is the mind which is the breeding ground of all disease. The mind is also the most powerful tool that a human being has, and it is the mind which shapes the history of men and nations. So with that background, I am also a certified neuro-linguistic programming practitioner, which allows me to practice and teach tools to my clients and patients to overcome situations which are shaping their future. And that also helps them to overcome their past. My current interests, in addition to my professional pursuits which I have mentioned above, I have interest in history, history of mankind, history of India, historical personalities, and human behavior. Also, I have an interest in common law and mathematics. I think I have said enough about myself. It's been a 2.5 minute discourse, so let us continue with our theme of this particular video. I would like to begin by reading out the Goldwater Rule, which is in essence the American Psychiatric Association guideline of medical ethics, which is described in section 7. And what it says is that it is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement. Now, I am first of all not a psychiatrist, as I've explained in the introduction. Secondly, I have not examined Mr. Nehru as a psychiatrist, and nor have I been granted proper authorization for a statement on his psychiatric health. As a matter of fact, this video is not about the psychiatric health of Mr. Nehru. It is just an exercise into exploring his psychology and how his psychological makeup affected the course of history of India. All the information has either been derived from his autobiography or from other records which are available in government archives or by authors of repute. Many books have been written about Nehru, some praising him, some criticizing him. For example, there is this book by Rajanikanth Puranik, and the title of the book is Nehru's 97 Major Blunders. And the June 2018 edition has enlarged it to 122 major blunders. There's another book written by a very capable and long-serving bureaucrat, Madhav Godbole, and the title of the book is The God Who Failed, an assessment of Jawaharlal Nehru's leadership. Well, this video is not an assessment of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's leadership. In fact, I am in no position to do that. However, as a human factors professional, I am entitled to an opinion based upon history and upon the reasons that caused these Nehruvian blunders, which ultimately affected the shape and had a tremendous effect on the history of our nation. At the outset, I would like to begin by saying that I am making some presuppositions which I have borrowed from my NLP background. The first presupposition is that each behavior is the best choice that an individual makes at a particular time. So there's no reason to cast aspersions or to doubt the integrity of a person. So I'm not going to say that Nehru did this because. I'm saying this: Nehru did what he did, and that was the outcome of certain factors which we shall be looking at during this video. The second point is that there are no incapable people. There are only incapable states. In other words, states of mind, the states of our psyche. Even short-term moods can alter history. So there are no incapable people. There are incapable states which sometimes a person or even a society or a community cannot overcome. That is the burden of history that we carry through generations. And finally, there is no such thing as failure. Only feedback exists. So this video is really a feedback. Feedback to historians, feedback to citizens, and feedback to people who want to evaluate Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. With the power and position that Mr. Nehru held in Indian history, he was responsible for and he oversaw many major events of history. For example, the partition of India in 1947, which resulted in a humanitarian disaster. Families were torn apart, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, millions were displaced. The second, which followed shortly after that, was the occupation of Kashmir by Pakistan, which resulted in the formation of an Azad Kashmir, which is actually another name for Pakistan occupied Kashmir. The third important instance of history which affected the course of our relationships with our neighbors and with certain communities within India was the introduction of Article 370 and followed by 35 capital A, which was recently overturned by the collective will of the people in the Parliament of India. And finally, one of the last sad parts of history which Mr. Nehru oversaw was the war with China. We shall be discussing the root causes of all these. I'm not going into the details of who did what and why that person did. The fact of the matter is a person behaved as an automaton because of the burden of collective history which was impressed upon the mind of one person. Let us take a look at territory. Here is the map of India, and what you see in that red box was the area of conflict from 1947 all the way up to 1962 when we entered into a short war with China, and it still continues to be a major bone of contention, aggression, debate, discussion and dispute till today. If we look at this map, the territory marked out with the red line is the territory that was ceded to India by the Maharaja of Kashmir, Sir Hari Singh. The entire territory came to India, and shortly after that, Pakistan sponsored the invasion of the northern areas. And after the short battle that ensued, the area held by India is that which is below the yellow line. The area marked as northern areas in green and above the yellow line belongs, or rather is under the control of Pakistan. This is what we generally call as Pak occupied Kashmir. In 1962, Chinese grabbed Aksai Chin, which is also another large part of Jammu and Kashmir, which belonged to India, and further Pakistan transferred territories which are shown above the yellow line. For those of you who wish to understand the numbers, we shall see in the next slide. This is a closer view which shows the areas held by different parties. On the left you see marked as POK, Pak occupied Kashmir, and above that on the north is Gilgit-Baltistan. This is also under Pakistani control. It's a proxy rule. The area marked in brown was grabbed by the Pakistanis and gifted to China, and the area shown as in light blue and shown as Aksai Chin was occupied by China in 1962 war. And what remains in red is Jammu and Kashmir, which is now divided into two union territories, one of Jammu and Kashmir and another one of Ladakh. Looking at the numbers, the total area of Kashmir, which was under Sir Hari Singh's rule, was close to 200,000 square kilometers or 2 lakh kilometers. If you look at the present state of affairs, Pakistan occupied Kashmir is 84,100 square kilometers. The area grabbed by China is a little more than 36,000 square kilometers. Ladakh occupies 96,700 square kilometers, and the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir as it stands today under Indian control is just 42,241 square kilometers. To give you a fair idea of what this means, Gujarat, one of the bigger states of India, has an area of 196,000 kilometers square. Karnataka, another big state, is even smaller. It is only 191,791 square kilometers. If Jammu and Kashmir in its entirety was a part of India as a whole, it would be having rank number 5 in terms of area. It would be the 5th largest state. One of the best source books for understanding the mind of Mr. Nehru is probably his autobiography. In fact, one intellectual from India, Ashish Nandi, has this to say about it. Mr. Nandi says, by today's standards, the autobiography may not be a great psychological document, but it remains the best clue we have to Nehru's personality. So on the basis of this, I have taken data or words of Mr. Nehru as authentic and genuine because they are his own testament. Just to put the frame of time in context, Mr. Nehru was born on 14th of November 1889 and he passed away on 27th of May 1964. This autobiography was published in 1936 when he was a mature 47-year-old leader leading the only or major political party of India and was a participant in many historical events. First of all, we all address our Prime Minister as Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, how come he is using this particular title? A Pandit is a person who is a Hindu scholar who is learned in Sanskrit and Hindu philosophy. Certainly, some ancestors of Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru were learned in Sanskrit and Hindu philosophy. In fact, they also had a thorough knowledge of Persian, which was the court language of the Mughals, and also a smattering of Arabic. But certainly, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru had no knowledge whatsoever of Sanskrit or Hindu philosophy. Another time that we use the word Pandit is addressing a practicing Hindu priest, a person who performs the rituals related to various Hindu religion rituals. He could be in a temple or he could be having his own setup for performing these rituals. Pandit is also a mode of addressing a learned man or a teacher, like Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, who was a very learned man, and he was the founder of the Banaras Hindu University, and who had served a number of terms as the Congress president. The word Pandit is also used to address a talented musician. All of us have heard about Pandit Ravi Shankar, Pandit Jasraj, and so many others. Of course, if that talented musician is a Muslim, then he is addressed as Ustad. If we go by this definition, Mr. Nehru does not qualify into any of these categories, and yet he did not oppose to being called Pandit. He was a very learned man. He was also a lawyer. How did he accept that epithet Pandit? There is only one reason for that, and that is his Kashmiri Brahmin family roots. He could trace his roots to the Brahmins of Kashmir who fled that place and settled in distant lands, and that is why he accepted being called as Pandit. That is his only link with the past, because his education, his political views, or his profession had nothing to do with the definition of a Pandit in the true meaning. Pandit is loosely used as a term to describe Hindus from Kashmir. And that is the way it was used by Pandit Nehru, by putting the word Pandit before his name. Let us now take a look at Mr. Nehru's views of himself. He has been quoted in A Tryst with Destiny, a book by Stanley Wolpert, published in 1997 by the Oxford University Press, in which he says, "I am the last Englishman to rule India." Mark these words, Englishman and rule. Mind you, Mr. Nehru was a Democrat, and yet he uses the word rule as if it were a right bestowed upon him by birth or through royalty. But that is not the point of discussion in this particular video. Mahatma Gandhi in Hindu Swaraj writes, "Indeed, Jawaharlal is more English than Indian in his thoughts and makeup." This is his mentor and somebody who was very close to him, and he has made these responsible remarks after much thought and contemplation. Indira Gandhi, who is Mr. Nehru's daughter and was later the Prime Minister of India, was a statesman and a very capable politician, and she was very close to his father because Mr. Nehru's wife Kamala Nehru died in 1937, and Indira Gandhi took care of her father at very close quarters, not just at home but also politically. And in the introduction to the autobiography of Mr. Nehru, she says that the purpose of this autobiography was not self-justification or rationalization. And further she says, but to show the rightness and inevitability of the actions and events in which he was a prime participant. Now mark these words, and they have been written by another intelligent woman. Inevitability of actions and events in which he was a prime participant. So we have to find out what was that inevitability. And that inevitability lies in the thinking process, in the mental conditioning, in the psyche of Mr. Nehru. If we can once discover what were the human factors that led to these Nehruvian blunders, we will not only be able to shape our destiny better, we will also be able to have a more considerate view and give him the place that he deserves in history. Presently, the pendulum swings between two extremes. On one end, some people consider him a god, a great architect, while some people demonize him. He was neither. He was in fact simply a victim of circumstances, a victim of collective history, and he was a victim who was led into making those blunders. What exactly were those accentuating circumstances will unravel as we progress with this particular presentation. Here is what Jawaharlal Nehru states in the first chapter, in the third paragraph of the autobiography. He says, "We were Kashmiris." He is talking about his ancestors or his ancestral roots. Over 200 years ago, early in 18th century, our ancestors came down from that mountainous valley to seek fame and fortune in the rich plains below. Well, there are a few things which we need to examine closely. The ancestors came down from that mountainous valley to seek fame and fortune. Now mind you, Kashmiri Pandits were the most affluent people in Kashmir in that particular moment of time and even later. So most probably they were either driven out or they were forced to leave for some reason. And that reason was the faith which they were following. It is a recorded history that there have been more than 7 exoduses of the Kashmiri Pandits from the Kashmir Valley to different parts of the country, principally Jammu or even Delhi. So this family of Kashmiris over 200 years ago, that is before the book was written in early 18th century, came down to Delhi and not Jammu. In the same chapter, Pandit Nehru continues that Farrukh Siyar was the emperor. In other words, he was the emperor of India and who had his throne in Delhi in the Red Fort. Raj Kaul was the name of the ancestor of ours. He had gained eminence as a Sanskrit and Persian scholar. In other words, he was entitled to use the word Pandit, but he never uses the title of Pandit for Raj Kaul or any of his other ancestors, even though they had gained eminence in Sanskrit as well as Persian. Probably at the emperor's insistence, the family migrated to Delhi about the year 1716. Now this is an interesting date because Farrukh Siyar ruled for about 6 years, from 1713 to 1719. So this family came down in the middle of his reign. It was a bloody reign. Farrukh Siyar came there through court intrigue, as we shall see shortly. Farrukh Siyar came to the throne in 1713 and reigned until 1719. And by all standards, it was a bloody reign. He slaughtered Sikhs by the thousands. As a matter of fact, historical records made by independent historians, particularly Persian and English historians, state that cart loads of the heads of Sikhs were brought to Delhi and they were displayed to the emperor. It was truly a reign of terror against the Sikhs. The bloody ascent of the throne, he had to murder and kill many of his kith and kind. And as a matter of fact, he also met a bloody end. Because the Sayyid brothers, who first of all were instrumental in installing him on the throne, also got rid of him. He was imprisoned, blinded, starved, and then finally murdered. So those were tumultuous times indeed. If you will recall from the previous slide, Raj Nehru, or Raj Kaul, as he was then called, the ancestor of Mr. Nehru, was given a big jagir. He was given an estate. But in these 3 years, which saw such tumultuous times that rapidly. Mr. Nehru continues in his autobiography to give us a brief history of Mr. Raj Kaul or Pandit Raj Kaul. We are told that a Jagir with a house situated on the banks of a canal had been granted to Raj Kaul, and from the fact of this residence, Nehru from Neher, a canal, came to be attached to his name. Mr. Nehru continues, Kaul changed to Kaul Nehru, and in later years, Kaul dropped out and we became Nehrus. We shall just explore that in a little depth in the context of history and historical records. Now, Jagir was something that was given to people by the ruler. It was a land grant. It wasn't money per se. That money paid regularly to people who were in the payroll was known as a wajifa or a wazifa. Well, a Jagir is not a wazifa, it is just a land grant. And the Mughals had a very disciplined way of administering justice, which was based on Quran principally. And Abul Fazl, who wrote the N.A. Akbari, a historical record, has set forth the requirements for the grant of a Jagir. And Abul Fazl says that there are 4 eligible classes for a Jagir. The first is those who are seekers of truth who had renounced the world. That is fakirs. Persons striving for conquering desires of the sense and chosen life of self-abnegation. So probably this is the equivalent of social workers who were running community kitchens or yatim khanas, that is orphanages and something of that nature. They were not doing it for themselves. They had conquered their desires and they were doing it for the good of people around them. The third category was the needy and poor and physically disabled. And finally, the fourth category was persons claiming noble birth and who foolishly deemed it below their dignity or social status to take up any trade or profession. Mr. Nehru does not elaborate in which category they fell in order to receive the Jagir. Next, let us explore and examine the word Nehru, which Mr. Nehru says derives from the word Neher, which is a canal. His ancestors were experts in Sanskrit, Persian, and had a knowledge of Arabic. And in fact, Nehru derives from Arabic word root, and which is formed by 3 syllables, Noon, Ha, and Ra. So the N, H, and R constitute the word root of Nehru. Most words in Arabic have some foundation in their holy book, the Holy Quran. This particular word occurs 113 times in the Holy Quran. 2 times as a verb, which is tanhar, which means to repel. 57 times as the nominal, which is nahar. You're all familiar with the word nahari. It deals with, or it refers to the day. Any activity that is diurnal, daily, referring to the day also derives from this word root. And in the Quran, it is used 53 times as a noun, and that noun is Nahar, which is a river, not just a canal. The plural for that is Anharu, which in India would be corrupted as Nehru. So that explains us the name Nehru, which is not a Kashmiri name at all. There are no Nehrus in Kashmir. The first Nehru that occurred was probably Raj Kaul or his later generation, who adopted an Arabic word root to describe their family name. And this became known as the Nehru family. Continuing further, in Mr. Nehru's autobiography, we are given a glimpse of the aftermath of the Great Revolt of 1847, which modern historians call as the First War of Independence. We are not discussing about the nomenclature of the event, but what Mr. Nehru has to say about this. He says that the family experienced many vicissitudes of fortune during the unsettled times that followed, and the Jagir dwindled and vanished away. So very soon there was no Jagir left, and there is no place that we can trace on the ground to describe the property that was granted to Raj Kaul. The reason why we are going sentence by sentence into the autobiography is because, first of all, it is Mr. Nehru's testament, and secondly, history has a great impact on the psychology of individuals and a community. This is very well documented all across the world, whether it is the extermination of Red Indians from the North American continent by the Europeans, or it is the extermination of Jews in Germany, or the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine when the Jews were settled there to create the state of Israel. In fact, Walter Benjamin, in his thesis on the philosophy of history, states that memory creates the chain of tradition which passes on a happening from generation to generation. It starts the web which all stories together form in the end. So all the stories that we are told in the autobiography ultimately weave into a web. And in that web we are caught by the turn of historical events which shapes the destiny of nations. Let us take a few more sentences from Mr. Nehru's autobiography. He says that my grandfather Gangadhar Nehru was Kotwal of Delhi for some time before the Great Revolt of 1857. Please mark the name, designation and the dates. Krishna Hathi Singh was the sister of Mr. Nehru. Hathi Singh was her married name. In the first chapter of her own autobiography has this to state about Mr. Gangadhar Nehru. Motilal's grandfather had been the first Vakil, that means the legal representative of the East India Company at the Shadow Court of Delhi. In other words, they were serving and in a good position as a legal representative of East India Company, which is the British, at the court of Delhi. And his father, Gangadhar Nehru, had been Kotwal, in brackets, Chief Magistrate of Delhi at the time of the revolt of 1857. Mind you, these are the words of the sister of Mr. Nehru in her autobiography. Krishna Hathi Singh continues, this had not, however, protected the family from the upheavals of that year. And which year is that? It is the year 1857. Having lost nearly all their possessions, the Nehrus had fled to Agra to avoid the terrible vengeance of the victorious East India Company, and they had narrowly escaped with their lives. Mark this word, to avoid the terrible vengeance of the victorious East India Company. Oh my God! I was told in the previous slide, just a few sentences earlier, by Mrs. Krishna Hathi Singh, that they were actually the representatives, the legal representatives of the East India Company. And how could they turn against their own Vakil? That is something that is not explained either by Mr. Nehru himself or by Mrs. Hathi Singh. If we dig a little deeper into the records which are available with the National Archives and in many other sources in Britain, here is what we find. There is no mention of any Nehru, Kaul or any other Hindu sounding name as the Kotwal of Delhi in any archival record. And all these archival records are well preserved, well documented and well researched. In fact, even the Mughals had a very good administrative system. Everything was written down, it was circulated, much like what is done today, like you mark copies to various people in your email, the same thing was done. All the orders from the commander-in-chief or from the king himself were passed down to the Kotwal, who had an army of clerks who made copies of that, and they were circulated in all the thanas or all the police districts of Delhi. Let us see what the historical records have to show. Mind you, all the records from the British era as well as from the Mughal era are very well documented and preserved in the National Archives and various other academic and scholarly circles. Here is one of them. Documents at the Center of South Asian Studies, University of Edinburgh. It states, in the second week of the uprising, Moinuddin Hasan Khan replaced Qazi Faizalullah. Shortly afterwards, Sayyid Mubarak Shah was appointed Kotwal, and he continued till the end. So we have three Kotwals in succession. So the first one was Qazi Faizalullah, who was succeeded by Moinuddin Hasan Khan in the second week of the revolt, and shortly afterwards, after that revolt, Sayyid Mubarak Shah was appointed the Kotwal. So we do not have any mention of a Kaul or a Nehru. So obviously, if Mr. Nehru and Mrs. Hathi Singh is referring to their ancestor having been a Kotwal of Delhi during the 1857, he must have been one of these three names. This particular fact also finds mention in the book Two Narratives by Charles Metcalfe in the chapter called The Narrative of Moinuddin Hasan Khan on page 50. First, we must understand the hierarchy of the police in Delhi at the time of the revolt. That means before, during and after the 1857 revolt. There used to be one Kotwal. He was reporting directly to the king. He was assisted by two deputy Kotwals. Under that Kotwal, there were 12 thanas or police jurisdictions or police stations. These were headed by 12 thanedars, and there was only one Hindu, and his name is Kumar Lal, who was the thanedar of Dariba, an area which is still in existence in Old Delhi. Each thana had jamadars and clerks. Jamadars are those who lead a small band of policemen, something like head constables, and they had clerks. As I explained earlier, these clerks were very busy because they had to transcribe all the orders that were coming from higher ups, and they are all well recorded. In turn, these were assisted by 42 constables and other ranks. Now the records also classify them according to the religion. There were 10 Hindus, 30 Muslims, and 2 other constables and other ranks whose religion has not been mentioned or determined. So as you can see that there is no Kotwal by the name that we have seen, and we know who the Kotwals were, and the fact that there was only one Hindu thanedar, also known as a Daroga of Thana Dariba. Mr. Nehru in his autobiography continues that Gangadhar died at the age of 34 in 1861. The revolt of 1857 put an end to our family connection with Delhi. And finally, there's a startling statement which says, all our family papers and documents were destroyed in the course of it. Please ponder on this last sentence. All the family papers and documents were destroyed. Destroyed where? The documents that were in their possession, which were to be used as passage to safety, or were they also destroyed, which apparently they have not been destroyed, in the archives and government records. Now this family, which started off as Kauls when they came to Delhi and then transformed into Nehru. Neher, as we saw, is the Arabic root word Nun, Ha, Ra. Plural is Anharu, which becomes Nehru. They migrated to Agra. In the autobiography, Mr. Nehru says the family, having lost nearly all that it possessed, joined the numerous fugitives who were leaving the old imperial city and went to Agra. Please take note of the word fugitive. Who would be a fugitive? Somebody who is being hunted down. Hunted down by whom? By the forces who have now taken charge of Delhi. Who were the victors? The British, the East India Company and their soldiers. Who were the losers? It was the Mughals. So the East India Company would be hunting down the Mughals or Mughal-like people or persons. Mind you, they had ancestral relationship with the same company as their legal representatives in the court of the Mughals. Let's continue further. The question that first comes is, while these fugitives were running, was Delhi unsafe for the Hindus after this revolt? That is the first question that arises. The facts that we have with us are quite the contrary. There was no place that was safer for the Hindus at that time than Delhi was after the 1857 revolt. The reason for that was both the aggressor as well as the Mughals were having large number of troops who were Hindus. There were Hindus who were fighting on the side of the Mughals and there were Hindus who were fighting on the side of the British. Let us see whether Delhi was unsafe or safe with the following notings in the various thanas and the orders of the king. Here is what happened in Delhi after the 1957 revolt as recorded in the records of the police. In virtually every thana, and as we saw, there were 12 thanas. Bakrid, the big festival celebrated by Muslims in memory of the deeds of Ibrahim, who was prepared to sacrifice his own son out of devotion to Allah and found that that son had been transformed by divine intervention into a goat. During this Bakrid festival, it is customary to slaughter animals and in particular bakra. And bakra in Arabic is not the goat as is known in Urdu, but it is the cow. There is a chapter in fact in Quran with the same name and it means the calf. A general order banning cow slaughter was passed in the city. In India, even though Article 48 states that no cow will be slaughtered in India, there is hue and cry from many sides of the opposition and liberals stating that this is a violation of a fundamental right and everybody has a right to eat what they wish. Now mind you, the Mughal emperor passes a general order banning cow slaughter in the city. And why is that so? He does not want to offend the Hindus who formed the majority of the troops on both the warring sides. And this has been recorded in every thana. In fact, there are pages and pages of correspondence that goes on with regard to this. The king said, arrest anyone who so much as even thinks of doing so. Anyone openly or secretly slaughtering cows would be given the death punishment. The Kotwal then wrote to all the thanedars to send him a list of cow-owning Muslims. In fact, initially, the emperor had passed an order through the commander-in-chief of his armed forces that all the cows should be brought for 3 days and sheltered in the thanas. But the Kotwal said that we do not have sufficient space to accommodate all of them. Therefore, they prepared a list and the owners of the cows who were Muslim had to give an undertaking. Mind you, anyone openly or secretly slaughtering cows would be given death punishment. At the same time, in the next sentence it said in that order, anybody making a false complaint would also meet with the same fate. The royal order said, count all the skins of dead animals and the amount of grease available with the butchers, and then keep a check on that so that nobody can bluff their way into slaughtering animals. This was the state of affairs in Delhi. So obviously, who were the people who were fleeing? Was it some Hindu who would have liked to flee from Delhi? Was it be some Kashmiri Pandit who would be fleeing Delhi? Delhi was the safest and the best place to be in at this point of time. Let us further see what Mr. Nehru has to say about his grandfather, who was supposed to be fleeing from Delhi as a fugitive. In a painting that we have of my grandfather, he wears a Mughal dress with a curved sword in his hand. And the picture that you see on the right is also from a government archive describing Mr. Nehru's grandfather. Not Mr. Nehru, yeah, Mr. Nehru's grandfather. And he might well be taken for a Mughal, although his features are distinctly Kashmiri. Now please tell me, in a picture of this size, with a beard and with a mustache and with a cap, can you distinguish any distinct Kashmiri features? That is just a literary flourish which Mr. Nehru has used in his autobiography. So obviously the people who were fleeing were, by deduction, if they were the Kotwals, they were not Hindu Nehrus. I will not say anything more. The facts are in front of you and it is for you to decide, determine and make your own opinion or conception of this. So far, we have only been looking at some historical facts mentioned by Mr. Nehru in his autobiography. What about some personal details, some feelings, emotions? There is a very interesting account of one character, Munshi Mubarak Ali. And this provides us with a key into looking at the way Mr. Nehru thought. Munshi Mubarak Ali was an employee and Mr. Nehru describes him as one of his early confidants. And he was a Munshi of my father and his name was Munshi Mubarak Ali. The revolt of 1857 had ruined the family and the English had partly exterminated it. In fact, his family was one of the victims of the witch hunt that was taking place following 1857 revolt and the takeover of Delhi by the British. This affliction had made him gentle and forbearing. Let's see the next slide, which reveals to us what was going on in the mind of the young child who became Mr. Nehru. He learned quite early in life that this was the story of two contrasting fates. One of a person who stuck to his faith and name, and the other one who was able to find a new identity for himself. We are going to do a comparative study between the contrasting fates of Munshi Mubarak Ali and his employer Motilal Nehru. Motilal Nehru was a story of survival and success. Mubarak Ali, by contrast, was the epitome of ruin and extermination. Motilal Nehru was the embodiment of strength and cleverness. In fact, he describes him in terms of masculinity, something that he would like to become one himself. In his own words, is how Mr. Nehru describes his father. Whereas Munshi Mubarak Ali was a poor, helpless employee afflicted by his fate. While Mr. Motilal Nehru was a masculine figure worthy of emulation and aspiration, he was a counterpoint to masculinity, a depiction of romanticized defeat. That was a reminder, and also it was a kind of explanation or an excuse for what the Nehrus did following their departure from Delhi in establishing a new identity for themselves. Collective memory is something with which anthropologists and psychologists are very familiar. Collective memory is the memory of a group of people, often belonging to a particular faith or nationality, who have been witness and who have suffered something in history collectively. It is not about individual memory. The boundaries of family are transcended and it becomes one common memory of a race. It's a psychological reaction to a traumatic event. For example, Judaism the most important collective memory that they all have is their expulsion from Egypt and being led by Moses to the promised land. Like that, we have many instances in history. And closer home, the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits from Kashmir is still very fresh in our memory. And I'm not talking about the exodus that happened in the 1990s. We can trace it back to more than 600 or 700 years in history. And it was in one of these exoduses during the Mughal times that the Kaul family was probably expelled from the valley and they found shelter in Delhi to establish a new identity as Nehru, which we saw derives from those three Arabic word roots, Na, Ha, Ra. Noon is N, Ha is H, and Ra is the Ru. This whole video is all about the psychological reaction of a traumatic event to a class of people, to a society, to a community, to the believers of a single faith. Since this affects the entire society, it is more than just a history, it's a collective recollection. In fact, it blends into day-to-day thinking, just as mythology governs our idiom, our metaphor, our behavior, and our rituals, so does collective memory taint every aspect of our life. Here is an Arabic word made up of three letters. First one is the H, Ha. Next one is Jim, the J, and then Ra. This is the Hijra. Hijra is migration or exodus. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, migrated from his hometown of Quraysh to Yathrib, which later became known as Munawwar al-Madina or simply Medina. It was a turning point of history, not just for him or for his tribe or his followers, but for the entire world. That is the power of exodus. So there was one exodus witnessed by Mr. Nehru's family, his community, and his group of people, which was in 1716. And there was a period of time till 1857 where things started getting better by adaptation. After all, it's only the fittest who survive, according to Charles Darwin. The second Hijra or migration or exodus happened in between 1857 and 1947. When I'm talking of exodus or migration or Hijra, it is the period of adaptation. And let us see how. The movement from Kashmir to Delhi in the reign of Farrukhsiyar was due to the ethnic cleansing that was taking place in the valley. Farrukhsiyar was too busy with court intrigue, murders, wars, politics to entertain anyone in his court for his learning abilities of Sanskrit and Persian and Arabic. Let us accept the fact, which has been described in milder words, that the family moved to Delhi as a part of an ethnic cleansing pogrom. Similarly, there was a second Hijra from Delhi to Agra. This was also because of identity. Being the Kotwal, and we have seen the three names of the Kotwals recorded in history in the archives, which preserve the records of the Mughal era. This was the second Hijra, where they had to re-establish a new identity. It is my guess that the Nehru identity actually took place during the second Hijra. Between 1716 to 1857, the new identity of being a court member gave them prosperity. It brought in a Jagir, and later on they were able to climb the ladder to become the Kotwal. Between the second Hijra, 1857 onwards, also required establishment of a new identity, in this case as a Hindu, and that too as a Kashmiri Pandit, which is the original identity. So there was in between a new identity which brought them the wealth, it brought them position, it brought them authority. till they faced the witch hunt of the Great Revolt. And mind you, that the witch hunt was against one particular community, and that was the Muslim community, and in particular people close to the royalty. The Hindus, by contrast, were very safe from both sides. Neither were the East India Company governors nor the Mughal rulers want to disturb that, and as we have seen earlier from the records, it is shown that even during the great celebration of Bakrid, the sacrifice of cows was banned and it was punishable by death. Similarly, the exodus after 1857 onwards brought in a new wave of prosperity, which was only possible because of the new identity. Mr. Nehru's autobiography gives us details of that prosperity. And there is no reason to doubt that particular thing, because many parts of that are also independently confirmed by Krishna Hathi Singh. When we talked about the Munshi, he finds mention in Krishna Hathi Singh's autobiography as well. A lot of studies have been done on the identity creation by people who suffer the indignities of such collective trauma. Given here is one such study, and in essence, the stages of rationalizing and adapting to these conditions goes through one of achieving self-esteem, finding continuity with the past, establishing distinctiveness, because you cannot afford to get lost and dissolved with the masses, a sense of belonging, and ultimate sense of meaning. The self-esteem part was well catered with the grant of a Jagir. The continuity we found in the autobiography of Mr. Nehru was mostly provided by women who continued with religious rituals, which surprisingly and strikingly were never followed by the men. Again, there is a sense of distinctiveness, because that distinctiveness comes from the name Nehru, which is an adaptation of an Arabic acronym or pseudonym. Again, there is a sense of belonging, which comes with the position that they acquired in the court, first with the Mughals and then later with the company, the East India Company, I mean. And finally, everything falls in place because you get an ultimate sense of meaning. What this last thing means is it was worth going through all those things. The changes of identity, the hijra, the exoduses, they all make a meaning not just in being living beings, but in finding a place in society. And of course, Mr. Nehru and of course his family did very well for themselves, both before and after independence. There is no doubt about it. So a new identity creation at every stage did help them tremendously. Another important factor which psychologists have discovered amongst survivors from such deeply disturbing traumatic events which affect the community is to derive a meaning from the trauma. The victims redefine who they are. That redefinition can take place through many means. It can be changes of name, it can be building up a narrative or a fable or a myth or a new mythology of sorts. Also, they have to construct a transgenerational collective identity. Otherwise, this whole struggle becomes meaningless. One interesting feature we must remember is what is often described as the Stockholm Syndrome. Many of you must have heard about it. This is the behavior of a victim of violence or some such trauma when the victim develops loyalty towards the oppressor. For example, Mr. Nehru, in various forms of his writings, speeches and behavior, often develops or has developed a loyalty towards both the British as well as the Mughals. In fact, all his history which he has written about India centers around Delhi and the Mughal rule, with scant regard for other parts of the country. Also, he has got tremendous loyalty for the English. As I said earlier, He has been quoted as having said that he is probably the last Englishman to rule India. This was a sentence which he used while having a chat with the ambassador of America, Mr. Galbraith, in Delhi. The workings of the mind of Mr. Nehru often come out very innocently. But we have the luxury of analyzing this after so many years. Taking a look at things in the past and from a distant perspective, the vision is always 2020 or 6 by 6. Here is a passage from the autobiography where he talks about his embarrassment with regard to statements made by Mahatma Gandhi. And Mr. Nehru says, "Even some of Gandhiji's phrases sometimes jarred upon me. Thus his frequent reference to Ram Raj as a golden age which was to return." So even a metaphorical use of a common phrase of Ram Raj to signify a rule of justice, a rule of equality, was construed by Mr. Nehru as something religious. And mind you, there were two identities behind which he was hiding, or three identities. The original people who left their homeland in Kashmir, then the new identity which they established and obtained a Jagir and rose to the rank of being the Kotwal of the capital city of Delhi, and then later once again reverting back to their Kashmiri Pandit identity and adapting into a yet another new identity as a Brown Sahib or as an Englishman, the last Englishman to rule India. So it is but natural for such utterances to come out, but they reveal a lot of dark places in the mind and heart of Mr. Nehru. Seen in the light of all that we have discussed so far, let us try to build a image or a model of what Nehruvian view of independence would be like. After all, he was a human being and his psychology was also tempered, shaped and created out of the collective and individual memory of that person. Independence would mean the British going away. That would also mean losing part of his own identity. He would also stand to lose English patronage, especially the relationship that he has enjoyed with the Viceroy, with the Governor General, with his wife Edwina, and so many other things. His recognition as a master of English language, one who was the best example of British gentleman in India. The second thing was the fear of return to Muslim domination. As we have seen, collective memory survives many generations. It becomes the part of myth. Even today, the story of Ram or the tales of Mahabharata or even the more ancient Puran, they happen to influence, they shape the lives of many Hindus in India, and in fact it is a living tale for them. The fear of return to Muslim domination was, in my opinion, the primary view of Nehru for his fear of independence from the British, apart from the loss of English patronage. And yet, the opportunity that was available to become the last Englishman to rule India must have also been very heavy in his mind. And these two must have been having a good tug of war inside his heart. The third thing was, which new identity would he have to don in order to survive an independent India without a partition? A partition would really be the best possible solution to overcome the trauma of all these generations. And let us see how. Throughout, we have seen that the Nehrus had an excellent skill at adaptation and survival and succeeding. And that is provided beautifully in the passage both in Mr. Nehru's autobiography and that of his sister Krishna Hati Singh in the story of Mubarak Ali, the Munshi Ji. If you adapt, you succeed, you survive masculinity. You fail, you become a miserable example of pity. So we can sum up the whole history in terms of the hijra or the migration. I'm using this word hijra for the simple reason that hijra is a transforming event. It is not just changing a city to find new employment, which Mr. Nehru tries to make out in the third paragraph of chapter 1. It was an existential crisis. It was either survive or die. That fear triggered rationalization, which he expresses as seeking a fortune. But as we have seen, the Kashmiri Pandits were quite an exclusive and well-off class during that time. So it was not a fortune that they were seeking. They were simply running to save their lives. Soon they discovered that a new identity, you can graduate from being just a scholar, which of course Mr. Raj Kaul was, to becoming the grantee of a Jagir and rising to the position of the Kotwal of Delhi. Somebody who takes his orders directly from the emperor. The next hijra was that to Agra, and that was also fueled or triggered by an existential crisis. That was when the fear was revisited. The same fear, the same survival, the same escape, which they had done a few generations ago at the time of Farrukh's year. And this existential crisis was overcome by donning a new identity, from the name of the Kotwal to a new name related to the location, and they became the new Nehrus. Thus, switching identity was a purely Nehruvian adaptation which had proved well and had been tested and perfected over generations. And one of the rewards of adaptation was the rise in politics, which he saw in his own lifetime. His father became a very wealthy man. He entered politics, public life, and of course that gave him a big handicap in starting his career in Indian politics and reaching the top with the blessings of people like Mahatma Gandhi and others. So, fear was the key to Nehruvian adaptation. Let us see how that unfolded for the history of India. As we saw, the fear of the Musalman was one thing which was there in the collective psyche of the Kashmiri Pandits which came during the time of Farrukh's year. It was subservience to the Mughal crown that got them all the riches, and later it was the subservience to the crown of the British which brought them prosperity, and ultimately it brought them a good name, place, anything that anybody could have wished for. If you do the Nehruvian arithmetic, you will find that the total Muslim population in India in the year 1947 was around 115 million. That's around 11.5 crore people. The total population of India was just a little over 300 million or 30 crore. If we were to look at that on this graphic, with a newly created Pakistan, at one stroke, or rather at the stroke of midnight, 75 million Muslims would be in another state. They would not pose any competitive threat to his place in history. Also, with the events that followed in Kashmir, another million would go into POK, and another 3 million Muslims would remain in the Jammu and Kashmir part, which was still with India. In the rest of divided India, there were 36 million or 3.5 crore Muslims at that point of time. If it was one combined undivided country, whatever would be the arrangement for governance after the British left, the bare fact is that out of a total of 300 million, 11.5 crore or 115 million were Muslims. And mind you, at that time, it was not the best of relationship between the two communities. There were centuries of history, and with education came new aspirations, both for Hindus as well as Muslims. Already there was a struggle for a Khilafat being established over India, which means India was to belong to a new colonial master, which would be under a universal Khalifa of the Muslim empire in the world. In that new order, Mr. Nehru would have had no place. He would still be that struggling person who was fighting for so-called independence. And therefore, the partition was a necessary step. The next best thing that could happen was to find himself a place in the world as a non-alignment leader. Most other countries who joined the non-alignment, people like Marshal Tito or Nasser or the Sri Lankans, they needed somebody who was an English-speaking gentleman. And he just fitted the bill to be a world-class leader, although with very little power. But this was providing with a new opportunity of discovering a new identity, an international identity, which was in line with the Nehruvian style of survival. This brings us to the last phase of Nehruvian history. And the time is the late 50s and the early 60s, culminating with the 62 war with China. Now, dealing with the Chinese had no previous cultural trauma or memory, no adaptation. For the first time, he was faced with a real enemy on which he had to take a decision. There was no memory or model or game plan of a hijrah in order to reply the Chinese and deal with them. As a matter of fact, he became very bold all of a sudden. And he is on record as having said on the 12th of October at Palam Airport before going to Colombo, where he told all the newspaper people that I have told the army to throw the Chinese out. This was quite out of line with the peace-loving Nehru that we have been portrayed. This was quite out of line with the collective suffering which the Kashmiri Pandits had undergone over the course of centuries. Where was this newfound courage? Well, it was not newfound courage. It was a statement made with no reference, no memory of a similar hijrah. And as we know, the consequences were really very bad because he had no compass, no historical, moral, or psychological compass to help him through this crisis. As a matter of fact, his biographers have said that this Chinese misadventure actually weakened him and he was a broken man, and that was what brought about his end. Most of us know the history after that. I will now summarize what we have gone through during this video. The first point to note is that we can gather the psychological roots of Nehruvian blunders from his own autobiography and through historical records in government archives and recordings made in books by very reliable historians and authors. The second point to note is the importance of collective trauma. This video was not to blame Nehru for anything, but just to show how he has been a victim of collective trauma. The lesson for us is we should not repeat the same thing. Another important point that we understand is that false narratives can harm a nation. How can we undo these false narratives? Is there a way to overcome the psychological roots? Can we erase collective trauma, trauma that has happened centuries ago? As a practitioner of healing arts, let me assure you that both at the individual as well as at the level of the society, there are ways and means which can heal these hurts. One such method which was tried by Nelson Mandela and which was replicated in some other parts of the world was in South Africa and in Bosnia and some other places was reconciliation. Because we must remember that both the aggressor and the victim are transformed by history. Just as we saw how the Nehru family, as victims of violence, underwent all these changes, so also the aggressors undergo a psychological crisis. And that is evident in the Indian Muslim identity and the Indian Muslim view of history. It is very difficult to overcome guilt, in fact, even more difficult to overcome than the suffering of a victim. So we have to be compassionate towards that and be more open towards that. And where do we go from here now? I think we are in very good times. I think we are living in very good times, and I have got tremendous hope in the future. For one thing, there is now legitimacy of the Hindutva identity. The Hindu is no more ashamed of calling himself a Hindu. He does not have to prove his credentials as a secular, as an egalitarian, as somebody who has to fit into a description which is described by a foreign power, something that Mr. Nehru was trying to do all his life, and which the party that he led is doing even today. So this legitimacy of Hindutva identity is one of the best things that is happening today, right in front of our eyes. The second thing is the readiness to face history. And this applies to both the sides, both the Hindus as well as Muslims. While the Hindus are establishing a very assertive and a very just identity for themselves, it is time that the Muslims also dissociate themselves from the deeds which were done by people of the same faith but not from the same country. They have to accept what has been recorded in history regarding the atrocities of different rulers at different times. And they have to accept the fact that they themselves are not implants or imports from another culture or another country. They are also the sons and daughters of the soils, and they are as much a victim of collective trauma as Mr. Nehru was, or as the Kashmiri Hindu Pandit is today. The Muslims are also similar in nature. They are also undergoing the same crisis and they are victims of the same collective trauma. The Indian convert is also a victim. And when I'm using the word convert, it is not necessarily in terms of religion. Indian converts to secularism. Indian converts to communism. They are all having this mechanism to adapt in order to survive. They should realize that in this free country, nobody needs to survive, but they do need to flourish. So they have to come out of that particular mindset. Fortunately, we are having a very vocal social media. So there is space for everyone. It's not a media controlled by any one particular party or an industrial house or a group of people. Even though social media also has restrictions, we cannot say it is totally independent, democratic or egalitarian. But even so, people have a way to express and to connect. Connection is the main thing which is different from what it was in the past. And finally, we have to overcome the shame of a defeated nation. In future, you should try to see every sentence that is uttered in public space. Is it the voice of a defeated nation? Is it the voice of a community which is trying to hide its shame and collective trauma? And then change the narrative accordingly. So that's all for now, my friends. Thank you very much for having devoted this time to listen to me. I end this video by saying Bharat Mata Ki Jai. Jai Hind.